As Christophe said, and I'm going to lay special emphasis on this point, none of us here tonight will be talking about wisdom as if we possessed it or even knew particularly what it is. So don't worry, we're not going to be preaching to you or trying to convert you to anything, at least I'm not. Instead, we're all asking a question in a very speculative and experimental mode. What might be the place and the meaning of wisdom in the contemporary world? This world is being described in this whole series of events as the technosphere, a mesh of technologies of different orders woven into the body of the earth, where human ideas have driven exploration and building and further knowledge to produce scaffoldings and rigs so that social or technical organizations have become inseparable from the diverse orders of nature, from geology and living things to the atmospheres that surround us. The technosphere is another way of talking about the Anthropocene, the proposed geological age, which you've all heard a lot about, where human industry has transformed the earth for millions of years to come. But the term, the technosphere, focuses our attention on the space in between human ideas and the forces of the non-human world, on technologies for transforming the world, such as oil extraction, atom splitting, or jet engines. It also points to technologies of knowledge, including telescopes and microscopes, experiments, simulations, and scanners, as have been presented here for the last 2 nights. But tonight, we're putting on the table techniques in a more corporeal, intimate, mental, and even spiritual form. Techniques which humans have devised and applied to train and reshape themselves. We have in mind here ascetic disciplines, gymnastics, yogas, structured patterns of action which transform not the external world, but the body and the mind. These habits are the backdrop for any technology or knowledge. Humans must first be shaped into the kinds of beings who can build and make, who can receive and create knowledge before they can build and make. Given the many years it takes for children to be able to operate at least semi-autonomously in the world that they inherit, training, Bildung, la formation, conditioning through anthropotechniques is inescapable to the human condition. Usually, this training aims at making sure that business continues exactly as usual. But by mixing trainings from one branch of learning with another, we also arrive at novelty. We extend experience, endurance, and perception. Historians of science have studied how new laboratory technologies produce new objects, new relations, how they manifest latencies and virtualities, and stabilize phenomena. Likewise, self-disciplines can tap into and redirect what William James called the energies of man. So tonight is about technologies of transformation and discovery, not only in the external world, but in the internal world. This also means an openness to older and often forgotten knowledges, classified often in categories that may seem far from global warming or environmental change. These categories include spiritual practice, religion, and self-help. Now, a reasonable question at this point might be, why? What does a history and speculative exploration of bodily techniques have to do with the Anthropocene? Why this line of thinking, when what we need are concrete technical solutions, new strategies of aesthetic representation, or better yet, political strategies that might allow experts, citizens, and even polluted oceans and shrinking ice caps to be heard over the constant clamor about security and profits, which usually drive our world? We do, of course, need to work on technical and scientific, artistic, and political forms to address environmental breakdown, which is caused by runaway consumption. But the Anthropocene names a situation which is so multifaceted, fast-changing, and unpredictable that the usual forms of problem-solving and expert advice are not sufficient. Its roots lie beyond the domains of the natural sciences. They're at the level of political and economic organization, but even more fundamentally, in habits of thought, feeling, and action, in imaginations, cravings, attitudes, relationships to nature, views of the good life, and what's possible. There can be no single solution to a super wicked problem like that. Instead, the question is how each of us, caught in the groove of our own trainings and experience, can deviate enough from our usual track to hear and build on something coming from another track, or perhaps forge a new one. In our final session tonight, from the formations group, we're going to be exposed to methods for undertaking just such transdisciplinary encounters. But we also need new ways of sensing the relationships we're part of. The relationship between switching on a light, deciding to drive instead of taking public transport, our desire for comfort, and the production of greenhouse gases and the crowding of the landfills. But this can take place at a level prior to the representations, whether arguments, facts, or even striking artistic realizations. Instead, it can be at the level of sensing invisible connections, learning to register their impact without words, without even symbols, perhaps to develop new senses and new modes of attunement. The two artistic presentations coming up in our first half move us in that direction. The whole point of such disciplines and anthropotechniques is that they're not a one-time thing, though. They're not a single event. They are long-term, even lifelong trainings, with heavy demands on your time and your patience. The question is how to sync new perceptions and attunements and motivations into the body and the mind, and how to make them hold. We're talking about something beyond facts, possibly even more than prudence, phronesis, or practical knowledge. It's about knowing with expanded and deepened senses, perhaps beyond the verifiably biophysical. Knowing not just what to do and say, but also how to refrain from action and remain silent. How to weigh among different ways of knowing and adapt them to shifting demands. Maybe even developing something like the wisdom techniques that are promised by the title tonight. Again, in some ways this sounds like a new way of talking about science, art, and politics, but it's also among the oldest. Philosophers and sociologists are well aware of this dimension of life. Durkheim talked about the physical basis behind collective representations and their emotional roots. Marcel Maus's bodily techniques inspired Pierre Bourdieu to write about the habitus as a structure of trained dispositions. Michel Foucault drew attention to the bodily discipline applied to individuals and populations at the intersection of human sciences, surveillance techniques, and institutions for training and reform. He later gave these disciplines a more positive spin by examining techniques of the self practiced by ancient philosophers to produce themselves as ethical subjects, introspection, writing, visualization, and prescriptions on diet, sleep, sex, and speech. This was an update on Nietzsche's obsession with the bodily origins of ideas and attitudes, including the violent mnemonics which created humans as the kind of animal who can keep a promise. A more recent effort, and a much more grandiose one, is Peter Sloterdijk's book, You Must Change Your Life. It proposes a new take on modernity, in fact, on human history, retold through the story of anthropotechniques, through training routines and disciplines. His argument dusts off some old notions, such as Karl Jasper's axial age, the era starting about 500 BCE, when new religions and philosophies appeared worldwide, laying emphasis on individual ethics and transcendence. For Sloterdijk, this decisive epoch in the history of world civilizations was the result, as for him, every great leap forward has been, of new anthropotechniques, ascetic and spiritual techniques in terms of fasting, meditation, development of attention, all of which require stepping out of the ordinary flow of the river of existence, and all of which result in new insights. These are the results of, like in the phrase of Spinoza, testing what a body can do. What happens if I repeat this phrase, if I maintain this pose, if I pay attention to my breath and quiet my thoughts, or visualize this form for just a little longer? What experience awaits us? What new way of being? What new flexibility or sensitivity becomes possible after repeating these courses, after making them into daily habits? For Sloterdijk, such trainings are the source of the most important innovations in the history of humanity. His book provides the first part of my title, There Are No Religions. What we take as essential to religion, that is, stories and credos about creation and the afterlife, moral codes, symbols, myths, and rituals, he claims are actually secondary phenomena. They appear after the founding act of any religion, in which an individual pushes farther and more fiercely along some new route of training, leading to an otherwise inaccessible truth. Returning to the group, they are met with with awestruck followers who respond to this incomprehensible account by turning it into a more relatable form. Moral prescriptions, rites, stories with elaborate scenographies of harmful spirits, ancestors, deities, and saints. So the heroic, and often in their first instance, solitary pursuits of these spiritual athletes provide new and difficult routes toward which even ordinary people can strive, new goals and new horizons, often framed in the form of liberation to an other world or a beyond. Sloterdijk insists there's no one true path forward, and certainly no fixed endpoint to reach. Each course of training is a largely blind striving toward an untested peak of Mount Improbable. Combining and merging distinct practice traditions results in new trainings which enrich the course of history. Take for example, St. Francis and his saintly path, which emerged through joining monastic renunciation with the naturalism and romantic emotionalism of courtly love poetry. Or Ignatius of Loyola, who fused the monastery's prayer, devotion, and introspection with knightly training in combat and self-sacrifice, and thereby became a guiding example for the counter-Reformation. Sloterdijk acknowledges a heavy debt to Foucault, but laments the excessive attention that Foucault gave to prisons, asylums, and hospitals, places for sequestering the abnormal. Instead, the most important actors for turning all of humanity into spiritual athletes were the great theorists of education in the modern period, and this is refreshing for those of us in the teaching profession. His main example is Johann Comenius, the 17th century Moravian who laid the foundations for modern mass education. The builders of schools had far wider effects than the builders of prisons, although both added to the store of methods for making and remaking bodies in order to create new minds. There is something refreshing about Sloterdijk's retelling of the emergence of the technosphere in terms of spiritual practices, training regimes, and anthropotechniques, and his call for widespread collection and comparison of these techniques, which all cultures possess, and which form the true basis of their differences, far beyond differences of genetic inheritance. He draws, however, only lightly on other cultures' practice traditions, though they are in many cases far more developed than those in the West. Hindu shastras, including the Artha Shastra, Dharma Shastra, Karma Shastras, as well as the Yoga Sutra, all of which inventory techniques for maximizing wisdom, pleasure, and the ability to rule over others by ruling first over oneself. Likewise, as in this Tibetan retreat temple built by the 5th Dalai Lama, which was recently introduced in an amazing show at the Wellcome Institute in London, Buddhist traditions preserve whole encyclopedias of physical and contemplative practices, which are aimed at loosening attachment to the self and cultivating insight into non-duality. At the Lukang Temple, these practices are ordered like items in a library or in a museum. They're depicted on this mural as a reference manual. Whoa, how long have I been working without pictures? It comes and goes. Then pictures are really important. Did you guys see St. Francis, at least? What shall I do? No. There's a picture of St. Francis shaking the hand of a wolf. Sorry you missed that. Well, hopefully we'll get the picture of this mural of Buddhist techniques, which was reconstructed at the Wellcome Institute. It's fantastic, and it's there as a manual for people. See? There's the temple, there's some Yoga Sutras. Here's Johann Comenius. Here's Ignatius in his mode of monk and his mode of soldier. There, as promised, St. Francis shaking the hands of various beasts. And here are the founders of religions on their individual quests, which, when they come back, become the basis for mythological and ritual forms. Sorry to give that one away. Western disciplines have tended to class such practices as beliefs or symbols, often evacuating their power. And when translated to the West, this has resulted in a neutralization of their ethical content and the wider frames of experience, as in consumerized yoga and secularized mindfulness training, where moment-to-moment attention is developed through certain exercises, but without the ethical framework of right action, speech, or livelihood, and without the end goal of liberation. While mindfulness has exposed millions to ancient Buddhist practices, it has often done so by grafting onto trainings aimed at marketing and management and survival in the corporate form. This is in line with the development that Sloterdijk traces in Western modernity, with a little help from Max Weber. Asceticism traveled from ancient routines of gymnastics and philosophy to the hothouse of the medieval monastery, and from there, with the opening of the monasteries at the Reformation, out into the world, in practices of war, politics, scholarship, arts, and sports. The drive for habits of self-control and self-transcendence continues, even after the primary goal of salvation has faded. It becomes a general athleticism adopted by nation-states to train a new populace, to create a new people, or imposed in neoliberal markets, where it becomes everyone's personal responsibility to adopt some form of practice as a means of wellness. Yet the West has made its greatest impact on the planet through its scientific and technical and industrial developments. So there seems an important oversight in Sloterdijk's story, one with great relevance for the discussion of the technosphere. It's a powerful tendency to consider science as a body of facts, theories, or attitudes, rather than as the physical and mental disciplines which prepare knowers to acquire and maintain bodies of knowledge and allow their expansion and modification. This screen is meant to be blank. Yet what would its history of technosciences look like if told through the history of training routines, disciplines, individual and collective anthropotechniques? What are the anthropotechniques of technoscience? How could we study technoscience not as a set of theories or even technical apparatus, but as a set of disciplined explorations of what both researchers and their objects might be capable of, expeditions from this base camp of Mount Improbable, combined and recombined? There are no religions, and science is one of them. The core of its knowledge, we might say, is anthropotechniques. The medieval monastery would still play a central role in this genealogy. Here, techniques of the vita contemplativa were integrated into forms of collective life at an astounding pitch of intensity, where every thought, act, and even breath was to be directed toward the single goal of salvation. This was the testing ground of manuscript culture and its scholarly habits, as well as the repetitions and trainings of the trivium, including rhetoric's topoi and theaters of memory, later renewed as a core of self-cultivation in the Renaissance. The quadrivium's habits of measurement and comparison were later in the Renaissance as well, grafted onto the skilled routines of craftsmen, giving birth to the mechanical philosophy. Yet even in the scientific revolution, spiritual practices form a strong through line. Notions of the good life and ascetic cultivation shaped modern natural philosophy, including the development of courtly manners, the habits of detached discernment, and plain speech embodied by Robert Boyle, as well as Newton's ascetic habits, in line with his idiosyncratic researches on alchemy and biblical history. Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy is a founding text of modern science. It begins with the philosopher's retreat from the world around him into a cell. Then, step by step, removal of all familiar reference points until he is left in contemplation of only clear and distinct ideas, the perfection of God, the truths of geometry. Yet while the text clears the path for mechanical science, its model is in fact the spiritual exercises of Ignatius of Loyola and the multi-day retreats which all Jesuits had to undertake, developing practices of memory and clear and distinct visualization. Modern science emerged through scripts that were laid out by the monastery and trainings of self-transformation. As historians of science Daston and Gallison have shown, an important part of what we understand by objectivity is the epistemic virtues and routine habits of mind which construct individual knowers. 18th century mathematics training continued the repetitions and writing habits of monasteries, then moved them out into the world in surveying, mapping, engineering. In 19th century Cambridge, the new mathematics curriculum was administered with shared drills and meticulously repeated proofs in a setting which combined fraternal solidarity with individual competition for the prize of being Wrangler, the top mathematician. This was in perfect resonance with the training in gymnastics, running, and rowing which mathematics students undertook. The reformed research universities of the late 19th century and new ones in the United States, such as Johns Hopkins, pictured here, borrowed from the Humboldtian model the ritual forms of the seminar, the disciplined repetitions, and the bricolage of the laboratory, and yet tied these to new gyms and new playing fields, new stadiums where the skills and virtues of the lab director and the administrator were echoed in those of the quarterback. This is even more the case in West Point Military Academy, where blackboards were first introduced in the US in mathematics training. They later spread to engineering and then to football, which in turn became training for scenario projection in war rooms. What kind of anthropotechniques of knowledge are we inculcating now? This is the big question. What are the training routines administered in schools or on individual self-directed courses of study which are producing or failing to produce virtuosic scenario planners, data miners, algorithm designers, and value creators? How do the bureaucratic habits of bioethics and internal review boards create an ethics of research, and in what ways do they prevent one from arising? What techniques now drive our training in programming, in working with probabilities, in forecasting, in evaluating expertise, and choosing among entirely different forms of expertise? Such inquiries into the anthropotechniques of scientific knowledge would give us a grip on a crucial strand in the technosphere, and one we must grasp if we have any hope of unraveling its current state and reweaving it into less self-destructive forms. How have humans produced the kinds of people for making scientific discoveries and technological innovations, building on past attainments, pushing them further, instituting them and extending them until they form a net of facticity and technical control, which now seems to us nearly inescapable? Further, what aspects of these trainings and practices have made them so blind when it comes to foreseeing the critical damage that will be brought by wide-scale industrialization? So deficient when it comes to grappling with the true causes of climate change, so powerless at redirecting the headlong path toward geocide or something near it upon which we seem to be embarked? What practices have allowed us to focus on a single problem or domain and its short-term solutions while we ignore its side effects and unforeseen consequences? Finally, this kind of approach would bring us back to the task we set at the outset, to imagine and institute new anthropotechniques, not to replace those currently in practice, but to combine with them in order to create subjects, ourselves first of all, who are capable of sustained awareness and orientation toward the relations and the consequences of our acts and those of our lawmakers and other powers upon the well-being of all of Earth's inhabitants. What trainings would provide the ground for instilling and renewing attitudes, motivations, and impulses which interrupt the status quo in our own routines and those of others? What new monasteries and exercise centers can we build or participate in to form subjects capable of responding thoughtfully and competently to expertise and intuitions, and maybe even to wisdom that reaches us from beyond the narrow tracks which have been set by our trainings up to now? Thank you.